and it's looking really, really strong. We've got a great looking composition. It's got good rhythm and repetition to it. It's got a good sense of depth that's happening in there. We've got a great focus, a very dynamic image of the skull with the sharp, jagged teeth sticking up out of the ground. We can see that there's some tree shapes that are starting to develop within this piece. The color scheme is working really nicely as well. And so what I want to go through within this demo is sort of talk to where a lot of you guys are at when it comes to you're at this stage, you've got your line work in there, you've got your color blocking. How can we take where we're at with understanding the colors, pulling the colors from our reference images, and then when I talk about with a lot of the reviews that I've been giving and a lot of the feedback is that some of the line making that's going on here isn't quite as strong as it could be. So we end up with this sort of fuzzy, not really the most intentional looking lines with what it is that we're designing for. Secondly, when it comes to the line work that's happening on the skull, this might not be finalized line work by any means, but we've got some really hairy lines that are starting to exist around this skull. The overall form and shape of it is really, really cool, and we can leave those hairy lines in there, but maybe there's a little bit more line weight that we can add to it, or we can drop those lines out on the skull altogether if that's the direction that we want to go. Either way, I've got a quick question for you. So these blue wave teeth looking things, are these supposed to be tree branches or what are these guys?
That's supposed to be the rib cage.
Okay, so we're looking inside of a rib cage, and then we've got so this thing is huge. It's not a tiny little
Yes.
skull. Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha. I wasn't sure if we were like at a really low angle and we were looking inside of like some tree overgrowth or if we were inside of a cave. Yeah, okay. So it's a rib cage. Cool. We can work with
I
that.
had a small creature towards the bottom left before to show the scale, but I took and taken it out because I thought it was just gonna muddle the whole thing. But I could add it back to make it clear that it's a huge skull.
No, that's the thing, right? So I'd actually seen some other people's projects where they're putting in a character for size reference within the shot in the scene, and those characters are not necessary for this. You can do it for your own portfolio later on, but for the turn in, we don't need to see a character within the shot. These are supposed to be environment background plates for animation for the character to be able to act on when it goes into production. In our minds right now, we are imagining that we are working in the environment background department of an animation studio for a television production. This one happens to be an adventure show that's taking place inside of a deep and dangerous jungle. So let's get in here and start refining some of these shapes that we're looking at. Now that I know that this is a rib cage, that helps out a lot. So whenever we're doing this, I always recommend to you guys to start in the very background and to start cleaning that type of stuff up. So I feel like already there's a pretty good, if we get all the way back here, we can see that these shapes are starting to drop back. So we're getting that idea of atmospheric perspective is present, which is really good to be able to see. Let me see if I can't do a little trickery here on your base layer since we're up to 150 DPI. And I'm going to go to my selection. So under the select dropdown, and I'm going to do select by color range. Maybe not something that you've done all that often before, but I'm going to select the black. And then from there, I can mess with the fuzziness. So I don't want it to be that fuzzy. I just want the black lines, as many of them as I can get. And here we go. That feels pretty good to me. All right. I might need to do this a second time, but let's go in and paste it. And so I just hit Control C, Control Shift V to be able to paste in place. I know that I do that awfully quick sometimes, but we've got pretty good collection of the black marks. By adding a color overlay, I can see what it is that I've actually been able to grab. I think we'll leave that there for now, just so that we've got a plate for the black stuff and we can start to paint underneath this. I'm just going to turn off the visibility. Let's give it a color so I can remember that it's there later on. But so if we've got our light that's entering down here, we can see that these are becoming a little bit more lighter. The trees are becoming a little bit more lighter. And we're going to want to work with those highlights and lowlights as we're starting to move forward within our composition. So I think that this is working overall pretty well. Let's start with this blue here. When you are going through and doing your flat coloring and your shading and getting your midtones in there and starting to develop your shadows, it's still really important that within the brush settings that we go through, and I'm going to work with the hard brush here at first, but I want to make sure that my shape dynamics is turned on. If you don't see your brush settings, you just need to go down to Window, the Window drop down, and go to Brush Settings, or hit F5 on your keyboard. From here, in the brush settings, we're going to hit Shape Dynamics. Then from there, hit the pin pressure, and we're going to turn that on. So pin pressure and turn it on. We want this little nice S-shaped looking design. What this is going to give me is a line that as I press down harder, it gets thicker. As I press down lighter, it gets thinner. This mimics a real world brush. Next thing that I want to do whenever I'm creating these line structures is to turn my smoothing within my brush up to 25%. You are not required to have the hands of a brain or heart surgeon to be a digital artist. Believe it or not, it's always good to have a steady hand and to be able to pull a straight line. But to keep the wiggles out, especially when we're working with this much DPI, turning up that smoothing can help an awful lot. So what I've just done is I've grabbed, excuse me, bit of a rough throat. I've grabbed this teal color from the back, and we're looking at the rib cage. So we've got the light that's coming in. The light is sort of this bluish, whitish looking light. I like the highlights that you're creating up on the rib cage as it moves forward. But when we're going through, I'm working on a fresh layer here. My opacity's up to, let's bring it up to like 80%. And I'm using the brackets to increase my brush size on the keyboard. And so starting way back here, you can imagine that maybe in some of these areas, the tree or the bushes that are starting to grow over it are getting over the top of these rib cages. So we want to mess with the outline and the border of those ribs. And what I'm really trying to do here is just think about where those highlights are going to hit on the rib cage as we're moving back. So from here to here, there's a little bit of a jump. They turn really blue, or sort of really dark blue down at the back. Let's see what I can do with your background image at this stage. So I want to go in and I'm going to lighten this up just a little bit since this is where the light's actually starting to break through. So we're getting a little bit lighter there. Excuse me. And I'm going to just use my lasso tool on this flat layer, and I'm going to mess with the color hue. So I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation. You've got this nice blue that's in there already, but let's see if we can tilt it just a little bit more green. So I just pushed it over just a little bit more green so that those tree forms match up just a little bit better. So I just hit Control Copy, and I'm going to undo what I just did just so that we can see the difference. All right, so I just turned them a little bit more green. Here's the color that they were before. So it's a nice purple color, but now we've got a little bit more blue-green that's starting to enter in from the back of our shot. Now, I don't think this is affecting our purple lighting that's coming in too much, but it helps us to visually connect with where the light is coming through and hitting these tree forms. So I hope this is making sense to you guys. From here, I'm going to continue to work forward with that bright green and those tree forms. And just think about, let's give a vine here, about what the light could be hitting. So maybe there's some other bush foliage that starts to come up over on this side. I'm at 80%. I can probably go up to 100% since I'm doing some. Let's give this guy just a little bit more plant matter, so a little bit more interesting leaf shapes that are starting to show up. And let's paint into this. So let's get some more interesting leaf shapes. On this side, again, what I'm trying to do is break up these lines so that they're still there. We're still seeing the rhythm of it, but we're getting the idea that there's some more stuff that's maybe showing up and popping through. So I can bring some of these vines down along the way just to be able to give us a little bit more rhythm, just to be able to break up that straight line of sight. Let's get a nice big leaf shape right here just to kind of overcut all that other stuff. All right, so I'm already starting to do it. And this is the point that I'm trying to make throughout this entire piece. So I'm working really small from the back first. And then I'm going to start working my way towards the rest of this piece. But the shapes that I'm creating are very, very intentional, even at this sort of blocking in stage. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to grab your darker color. Let's see if I can't. Now, if I overdo this, if I overuse this tool, it's the burn tool, you'll be able to tell that I'm overusing it pretty fast. All right, so we're just going to drop some of that stuff out just so that it blends a little bit better. Let me take whatever color that was that it just created. Be a little bit more intentional with the shading. There we go. Okay. Ooh, that's starting to work. It's a little bit of a messy line, but that's okay. Now, the next thing I want to do is just connect these layers and these pieces that I'm starting to draw, and just at the back of them, starting to fuzzy them out just a little bit more so that they connect just a little bit more smoothly with what we already have within the piece. Okay. Let them drift away up into the shadows. Okay. That's working well for me. That looks nice. So now we're getting a little bit more foliage. We can see how little bit of it we had a second ago. That's working pretty good for me. Now we want to marry um, our bright layer. So we still got this bright layer that we're kind of working through for where the leaves are hanging down. Let's not forget about the shrubbery and the bushes and stuff within our shot. I can probably at this point use more of a rim light since we're getting so far away from the entrance, but let's continue to drop that stuff down. So this color right here is a good natural progression of that light dissipating. And I want to just break up the edges of that stuff a little bit. So giving it some teeth. I'm not trying to do like all of the foliage here. All right, sharp leaf. It's 1, 2, 3, sharp leaf. 1, 2, 3. Get some more foliage going on here, some more hanging plants and vines, or at least the impression of it. That's starting to meld itself into. And with each one of these, so we've got a really, really blurry kind of background right now. This blurry background is great because if you squint your eyes and let your eyes go out of focus, you can kind of imagine where the highlights are going to take place at within this shot. I can continue to pull some of these down a little bit further. We don't need to see all of them. All right, there we go. And again, making some room for those highlights to be able to exist. That's working good for me to be able to break up the edge of this thing. And does it need a vine? Yeah, let's give it a vine. Okay. So we got one more vine going all the way through here now. All right, that'll work for me. Now I'm going to take that nice bright color that I was using a moment ago, and I'm going to just start doing some edge work on these items. So we're imagining now that the light is just starting to hit the edge of some of these leaves. And we've got our leaves right here, here. We're showing just a few more of them that are starting to get highlighted. That one can get a highlight, a little bit of a highlight here, moving on back. This is probably a good example of when I should start turning the brush down from 100%, but we're going to keep it going. All right, so that's looking good. Let's get in here and continue with just some of those little tiny leaf highlights that are starting to catch some of that brightness. And I can use the smudge tool just to be able to soften some of them so they're not quite as strong, and we're keeping the emphasis where it needs to be. So now we're giving the idea, the impression that there is a good amount of light that we're losing and starting to dissipate. So let's bring just softening the edges as this stuff rolls kind of back. And now we're in a good sort of middle foreground for the piece, and we can start adding in some of these darker colors. So as we move up to the top here, you can see this is one of the darkest colors that you're currently using. We're also using a lot of this olive green color. So I want to start introducing that. I'm going to do this on a new layer to the background here. And this is just going to help to clean up some of the areas. All right. So while I'm doing this, I'm trying to be really intentional with the shapes that I'm drawing. And this is where I see the biggest sort of gap between the people who have been doing, digital art for a year or two, and then the folks that are just green, green, green and coming right into this and trying to figure out what's going on. So with this, while I'm dropping in this kind of dark olive green color, you can see that I'm painting shapes. What I'm drawing here, I'm not exactly painting. I'm really more drawing. Think of this as like using colored pencils, is how this is working. And and I'm really being trying to be intentional about these shapes that I'm crafting within this shot. So we can still leave some of that purple in there. I like it. I'm going to go back to the bones here in a second before we move fully into the to the middle ground.
Also, real quick, I did want the purple in like intentionally. That was like an experiment thing. I didn't
No,
really
I
know
think it
how
looks
to
cool.
like. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's great. No worries, man. I think the color is an excellent balance between what we've got going on here. So with this brown layer that I'm going through and creating, so I've made my brush just a little bit larger so I can fill this in a little bit faster for you guys. I'm going through and I'm creating my shadow layer now. But you can see the variation within the shapes that I'm creating. So we've got this, let me just switch my color real quick so I can point out what I'm doing and what it is I'm talking about specifically. So within this area, right, that little shape that I just created is a really good abstracted shape. We've got a big section to it. It's got some branches that are coming off of it that are these little nodules or nubs that I'm creating. And it's going to work really, really well to trick and kind of camouflage the viewer's eye into feeling like they're looking at some dense jungle foliage here. The goal is still at 100%, to go through and work this whole little section so that as things start to get higher up into this, we start to lose some of that just flat green. And we're starting to create a balance between what's going on with the with the shadows and starting to really create that depth. Here we go. I can work a little bit bigger. Get here. I like some of these shapes that are going on. I'm still working at 100% while I'm doing this. So essentially, this is like really thick line work that I'm creating. This is going to be the first time I drop it down to like 50% as I start to paint in. So now I know that I've got half values on here. So if I went back over this a second time, I can get there we go, my values all the way back up to what I was painting in before. But this allows me to start painting in, instead of just using the fuzzy brush, painting in a gradient within my shot. And you can see how much, paint over this just a little bit, texture I'm starting to create within this whole little section here. Now I've got the ability, now that I'm at 50%, to be able to go back in to some of those previous layers, again, with just one little quick brush work, and start dropping some of this stuff back even more. I'm just working out from what I created a second ago. And now I'm starting to get some really, really cool, dense vegetation that's occurring. We've also got this nice green here that exists. I'm at 50% still. So I want to keep some of that green, start pulling it and pushing it into some of the leaf forms. Let's go back up to 100%. I think we'll be all right with that for now. There we go. And getting some more variation. I also like the purple that's showing up there. There we go. Cool. So let's just take a quick look at, now that we're starting to work our way through this thing. I'm not going overly detailed. That's for up in this space, but here's what it looks like with these 4 layers that I've just created as I've started to go through the shading pass, working my way from the back to the front. So if we turn off, you can see how much I was able to accomplish with just that one color on this level. So that dark brown does an awful lot within there. My light greens, without those on, again, another light green layer just to be able to break it up, and then a slight color shift at the back. So let's build up from the back. We've got our slightly color shifted green from the purple, building in some more foliage to make it feel a little bit more dense and a little bit more jungle-like. More foliage up on this next level, but a little bit darker than what we had before. And now we're starting to move in here with something that's quite a bit darker as well. See where I'm heading with this? Starting to work pretty well. All right, so same thing with this guy. Around the skull, we've got these really nice teeth that are sticking out. So because these teeth look so great, we want to really drop back all this stuff that's over here. Now, let's not forget that we can still go through and create those leaf forms, especially over some of our highlights that we start to develop. So I'm just going to pull out my leaf form. There we go. So I'm breaking up what's going on inside of there. Let's leave very little green within this space, maybe just a couple little leaves that are starting to pop and show up. But for the most part, they're going to be covered. There we go. So we've got that purple color. That one's really nice. This is a good spot to start inserting some of that purple, just to be able to let this stuff still stand out and have a little bit of rim lighting. That looks nice, but not overdoing it. Okay. And so we said that we wanted the rib cage to start looking more like a rib cage. What's going on with that is we've got no real kind of direction with the way that we're rendering it to make it look like bone. So I want to be able to help you out with that just a little bit. So right now I'm on the burn tool and I'm just dropping down my value within here. I can also grab my layer. Let's go to like a super dark purple that you're using. That looks really nice. And let's start filling in some of that back here. All right. Off click the layer. Check it out. All right. So that purple looking pretty good for me. Still not as clean around those teeth as it could be. There we go. That's looking nice. So that'll give us some good contrast and it's giving us a good little focal area. Let's start working on the bone now. So with the ribs and the bone cage, I've got my layers pretty well sorted, so I can go back in between each one of these layers and start working on the bone. Where this is working, and this is, that part about kind of having a good direction here. Right here, we're starting to get some indents. We're starting to get some good uneven surface that we're creating, some good layering that's going on, some good little pock marks that really describe this as being a rotting kind of old bone. However, up here at the top, in this section, it really starts to fall apart. We're losing some of that fine texture detail, especially within this one. So this is one of the big reasons why I wanted to be able to look at your piece this evening and actually kind of help you work through it. So here's how we continue forward. So we just need to be a little bit more intentional with the shapes that we're creating for our highlights. So the highlights that you have in this section right here, looking great. The highlights up at the top over here, not quite as good. Sorry, sipping some coffee. Okay, so I'm on a fresh layer, and this isn't one of my greens, but I want to go through and let's use one of those textured brushes that you're working with. So we've got Ultimate Charcoal Palooza, Pastel Palooza. No, which one was it? I think it's no. There it is. MB Line Art Legendary is a great one within the brush pack. So sorry, let me show you again. Under the drop down, so that MB percentage 20 starter pack, whatever, that crazy name, there's a brush in there called MB Line Art Legendary, and that one is your new best bud. It works great. So I'm going to start working through these highlights. Bring my brush, I'm at 100%. Let's make sure that I've still got my shape dynamics on. My smoothing has been turned off. Just checking for that before I get into this brush and really start painting. And this brush is lovely for creating all these cracks and crevices. So what I want you to think about is, I'm getting a little bit close here. I could probably work a little bit further back, but is creating just sort of a rough bone structure. So we get the idea that this thing is porous with its design. All right, same thing here. Just going to do a little bit of a highlight so that way I've got some control over it within my color scheme. Got another one here. It's a good little highlight. And again, I want to sort of crack these bones and give them some line art that's intentional or feels a little bit more intentional than maybe what you had there a moment ago. So same thing on top of this, going through making sure that I get at least one good piece of rim art. And we're just going to contrast it with the leaf shapes with some speckling that's happening to show that it's got holes in it and some good little crosses and other lines along the way. Okay, there we go. So that's looking a little bit better. Let's go in here and create another one that's just getting started. All right, so that's going to help us fill in that little gap. That's looking good. This whole section's looking strong. Let's go into this one and start giving it the same treatment. So what's our color? Yep, it's good and bright. I like the way that that's fading off there. And we've got some pock marks. So we want to just sort of break it up, give it some of those bones and cracks and other shapes that are going on here. This part as it's starting to get the light. There it is. So this is sort of rhythm painting. If you think about being like a drummer or something like that, there is a rhythm, like a to how drummers go through and make their beats. And the same thing is what I'm doing right now with the way that I'm creating these dots and these spots is that I'm trying to create an intentional looking shape that has a rhythm and a flow to it. The more that you can insert this rhythm and flow between your shape lines and start to feel it within your painting, the better the overall painting is going to look. It's going to feel a lot stronger and a lot more intentional as we start to get done and finish this guy up. All right, so we got our bone shape, again, cracks in the bone, highlighting some of these things. And what I want to be able to do is, after this sort of paint over that I'm doing, that's looking pretty good. Let's pull up and back. Make it just a little bit looser right there. Pull it up off of that tree. There we go. So still keeping some of the intentional chalkiness of what this brush does so well. Dropping some of that in there. That's looking pretty good. Let's go into this top one and give that one just a little bit stronger of a paint job. So we really want this to catch that light. Again, we know that the bone is going to be porous. It's going to have different cracks and other things that are running through it. So this is giving me something on one flat layer to be able to paint with. And so I'm just kind of stippling. I don't want to spend my entire life stippling. That's not what I want for you guys to do. That was the whole point of this project, was not to sit there and draw every single leaf in your painting, but this will help out. So now I'm just going to soften some of this stuff up that I've been creating. Not overusing the smudge tool, just using it just at the edges of stuff where I think it can be blended together just a little bit better. All right, so that's looking pretty good. And now we're starting to create that interesting texture throughout the piece so that when we turn this off, now we've got that lighting that's working through there throughout the entire thing. Let's do something cool with this. So I want to go in and I've got this super bright teal from the background. I'm going to change my brush again. So this time I'm actually going to use the fuzzy brush. I don't use the fuzzy brush very often, but I've turned the opacity down to like 36% on it. I'm on a new layer. Turn it off. All right. So There we go. So now we've got a little bit more brightness that's starting to fade back. It's brighter down by the entrance where the light is coming in. And then it's getting dimmer, but we're still getting a little bit of it up towards the front. So I think that's working pretty well overall. Let me go back to my, my brush that I was using just a second ago. MB Line Art Legendary. And let's not forget about this fella as well. And just pushing those highlights to where they feel a little bit more intentional and they're not quite so blurry. Instead, I'm trying to paint shapes as much as I can, even though I know this is a texture that I'm creating. But if I can infuse those shape lines in those directions, even with this texture stuff that I'm creating now, the better my final painting is going to be. There we go. In there. Cool. So that's starting to feel pretty good for me. The transition. Now we've got our super dark color. Let's go over the top of all that stuff that we were creating before, and let's start painting out some of the edges. And cutting into the dense foliage. So I'm going to try and define this foliage just a little bit better. We've got a tree over here on the left-hand side that's growing up in our swamp. I don't want to forget about him, but I do want to kind of carve out some of these shapes a little bit better. All right, there we go. So that's some good dense foliage that's going on within this part. We could have some other colors that are entering. That's cool with me. Let's get some of this, since it's in the foreground, a little bit darker as well. Again, right on the edge of the skull. I'm going to drop down some of this. I like it that we've got a light within the back of the forest and some of the colors that are starting to show up. I still want to outline. There we go. I'm going to break this up a little bit more. There we go. Nice. Dropping it back again because we're getting darker away from the light. And this sort of layered scribbling. Here we go. There it is. Some of the leaf forms, still want to keep those around, but I want it to be nice and dark around the skull. Cool. All right, so that's looking good. We're starting to actually build something. Just a couple more of them just to be able to transition from that section into the other. And now we're getting a really nice group of flowers. And we can start to pull in some of these greens from before. So I'm going to work on another layer. Just as if the light's hitting them just a little bit here and there for where the highlights would be. Okay, so that's working pretty good for me. Like it. All right. What to do next? So we've got the top left-hand side and the top right to be able to work through now. For the top right, this is one of those, where do we want the focus to be within the piece? Yeah, I could go through and detail out every single little tree branch within here. We do have a really nice bit of green space. And I like the way that the tree lights are starting to show up. There's a little bit of bounce light that's happening on the skull that you're inferring right here that I think is working nicely. So maybe we can pull in some of this light color on this tree and save a little bit of it. But a lot of this stuff in the top right-hand side, we can lose to shadow. So let's go in here and I'm going to drop some of this stuff back. So I'm working really large. And we're going to turn it off. So we're still retaining some of that texture that was there before, but I'm letting a lot of it disappear. Okay, so it's just not quite as important to our final illustration. So let it go and drop it down. All right, there we go. Cool. Going to use the smudge tool just a little bit more here. And we said we wanted some of that bounce lighting from the other side going on. So let's pick it up. What have we got? We got this sort of medium green color. Let's bring that over to the green and just a little bit lighter. And I'm going to do a new layer here. So in this super deep, dense area, now this is something I've learned from doing a lot of landscape painting, plein air and on site, is how to be able to go through and get those brushes. So I'm giving it just a little bit of brightness. Let's give it a little bit more brightness, just a couple little glints of light that are somehow starting to get through within some of these areas can really help a lot. I can soften this up with the smudge tool, but I'm really not pushing it around too much, just a little tiny bit. So it's just a little bit more blurry. There we go. That's feeling good to me. Nice. All right. Now, for this tree within the foreground, likely since I just did this, I can darken up the rib cage and the top of that as well. But I like these purples that are coming through on it. You could even take some of this purple here. Let's do a new layer on top and integrate some of this purple into the trees. Just to be able to keep that same color moving through the rest of the piece so that we're not getting flat, just all green everywhere all the time, and it doesn't become too just sort of boring to look at. So what I'm going to do here is insert some of this purple, and then we're going to mess with the layer interpretation. And we should get one of these where a little bit of it starts to show up still. Oh, that was kind of nice. All right. I think that's us. So without it on, and that gives us just a little bit of hue to push it towards the purple. Let's go in. Got a new layer. Yeah, that's a blank layer. Turn down my opacity to like 37%, and let's go over it just one more time with that same purple color, just to push a little bit more of the purple into the space. Whenever you have sort of boring areas like this that you can fill up, this is sort of a good indicator of when you can go into your shadows and start doing some color play and adding some more interest to them, just so that they've got a little bit more technical rhythm rather than just having a flat green space within here. So you see that I've got all my leaves that I've built up, but I haven't drawn every single leaf. I haven't drawn every single little bush shape, but it's got the impression of a whole bunch of foliage. Last thing we want to do coming out of here, I just thought about this. Sorry, thanks for your patience, is to go in, and we got to do it since we've been establishing it everywhere else, is give us a vine. Oh yeah, definitely needs a vine. There we go. So now we got another one that's coming over here, and let's do one more that's hanging down in this space. Just cutting all the way through the composition. I don't know if those are straight. I don't think they are. Okay. There we go. All right. So with those vines, same thing we want to do is take them and give them a little bit of a highlight, going all the way down. I'm using my super bright highlight right now just to really get them to stand out. This will help to layer and overlap and break up some of that repetition that we've been designing and creating. It also allows you to be able to add a little bit more detail to those vines. So this is rim lighting. And do it on the inside for where the light's showing up. That looks pretty nice to me for the vines that are hanging down. And now we've got this tree within the foreground in the bottom right-hand side that we need to do something with. So the tree right now is got some browns in it, but this is in our extreme foreground. And we know with atmospheric perspective that whatever is in the extreme foreground is going to have the most contrast. So our darks on this tree are going to be some of the darkest darks within my entire composition. Let's go through, make this totally black. Now, for this tree that's just chilling here, not really, it's sort of placed. It's okay, but we've been establishing a rhythm and a pattern of plants sort of sticking out next to each one of those ribs. Let's see if we can't take some of those same plant shapes that we've been describing everywhere else and put them directly over the top of the tree. So I'm going to go back into my hard brush. So I'm not messing with this transparent business. Smoothing, turn that back on to 25%. Get out of here. 5%. And let's do some brush shapes. Or sorry, some leaf shapes up within this space. So I can do some high grass, some little sharp ones, some leafy ones. Bold moves. Ouch. Oh, man, that's hard to do because I like the rhythm that I've created over the entire thing, but kill your darlings. And then we can always subtract this later on down the line if we feel like there's too much of it. There we go. That's all looking nice. And last thing that I want to do, since this is a tree, right, we've got the opportunity to be able to add some cool highlights onto the tree itself to help the bark stand out and look a little bit more interesting. So let's give it just some of that rim lighting as well. And this is the first time that we're using this sort of green color for the rim lighting, but maybe the light from the entrance is interacting a little bit different with the tree. And because this is all the way in the foreground, this means that we've got the most, I'm using my shape brush again, the most contrast and the most saturation within our space. So I'm just sort of doing this essentially scribbly shape right now, but trying to be somewhat intentional. And now that's looking pretty good. We've got our green going through here. Let's give a little bit of green moss to that side. And what I want to do is I'm going to grab, you should paint this. It's always going to look better if you paint it. But my dodge tool, just to be able to totally brighten this stuff up. And now the audience should mentally recognize that this is something that's way up in the foreground of my piece because it's catching such a highlight compared to the rest of it. And now that tree looks like it's much, much closer. Same thing could happen with these leaves that we were developing. So this is one of those where I do need to go in a little bit tighter. Yeah, I'm on the hard round brush. I don't know why it's not drawing at 100% right now. It still looks a little bit transparent. So yeah, this is in the extreme foreground. Yeah, you got to get up really close on these things. I'm working on the same layer. That was a mistake. I should have done my highlights on a secondary layer so that I could still do that same trick with the dodge tool. Now, if I try and use the dodge tool, it's just going to turn all the black stuff gray, and I don't want that to happen. Here we go. So giving just a little bit of rim lighting, a little bit of highlights. Maybe I can be sort of tight and intentional with this if I use the dodge tool just a little bit. There we go. Right up at the top there. Putting it on the edge. And that's looking pretty good. All right, let's try it. I'm okay with it. Let's get in here. Last thing I want to do is I'm going to grab that entire layer. Let's pick this color. Let me use the soft round brush now. Opacity, 29%. Okay. Let's try that again with the dodge. So those areas that we let be bright just a second ago are just going to get even brighter. And now we're adding a little bit more green tone to it. Smudge it down at the bottom so that it just sort of disappears into the, not overdoing it with the smudge tool, into the base. All right, so that looks pretty good to me. So now we've got some, and then I can always go back and image adjustments, brightness, contrast. Let's turn down the brightness just a little bit, turn up the contrast just a little bit more. There it goes. I think that feels good and balanced for our foreground item. And yeah, man, we've got the upper left-hand side to do, so that's got a little bit more depth to it. So let's start making some decisions on the depth. If we imagine that our tree is, some of these trees are back in this space over on the upper left-hand side, well, then let's paint those trees in on that color. I'm still using my fuzzy brush. Not my best choice in the entire world, but let's get some fuzzy tree branches and make them feel intentional as we're moving way back there, and maybe even get some of that jungle fog within this piece too. So we've got some other colors that we're working with. I'm trying to find just sort of a good sort of distance green color. I think that this one was working pretty well. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to make up where our light source is coming from. We said it's coming from the sort of left-hand side. Oops, left-hand side over here. So I'm going to paint some of these in. Let's get it going over the over these sections, just so that we're breaking it up just a little bit more. A little bit of a highlight in some of these trees way back in the back. I like how the colors are really dissipating. Give it some more of that green. A little bit of a highlight. That's reaching over a little bit too much. We've got it really dark right here, so let's try and find the balancing point between how dark this is. It's going to be really dark up at the top, and then get lighter as we're moving further away. There we go. That's going to work for me. Drop it down. And we want it to get lighter as it's moving further off within the jungle. So what is our bright color that we're using? We've got this color right here, which is pretty nice, which seems unintuitive as we get really far away to start pulling some of that stuff in here. But let's just give it a go. So this is the brightest portion. Take my opacity down to like 33%, 25%. Use that smudge tool just a little bit. Not too much. So I'm usually pushing with it down and then over. Okay, cool. So that is looking much more foresty and much more off in the distance than what we had a second ago. Like there's a light source happening there too, which is nice. Let's go over that and just sort of drop it down just a little bit more. Okay, so it's not quite as deep as what we saw, but we're still getting some good depth going on within the forest. I like it. That's working pretty well for me. We've got some more fun stuff to be able to do with the skull here that I want to talk about and address. So right now within this illustration, there's this almost like glowing water that's taking place. That's a no-no. We gotta let some of that stuff go, man. For the bright glowing water, that just ain't gonna work for how we're establishing our light source within this piece. So got my fuzzy brush on. I'm going to use the textured brush. So let's go back to MB Line Art Legendary. And we got to drop some of this stuff away and just let it go. Let it go. Okay. So we can still have the water get highlighted, but all this cool stuff that's underneath the skull, there's no reason for light to be coming from there unless you've got some kind of glowing treasure or something. But that's really creating three different light sources within your scene, and it gets a little bit confusing. It's not the best call. So we're just gonna drop some of that stuff out. The skull will still be there; it'll still be present, but we can't have the glowing water within this section. All right, let some of that drop away. Give those a little bit of a reflection under the water. And let that water start to turn a little bit more black. Okay. So we've got some highlights. See this whole little part here doesn't need to be particularly highlighted. We'll get that we'll be able to understand that it's water. Pull in some of these shadows on the skull just a little bit darker here and there. Dropping down some of that water, we will still be able to tell that it's water here in just a moment. So now we've got what's a bright watercolor? That's your bright watercolor. Let's go back and let's sprinkle these just a little bit so that we're catching some little glints and lights of reflection, but we don't need to do too much. And since it's dropping down, give it some kind of splash area. This would still be an effect for the effects team. But the next thing I want you to do is where you've got your super bright highlight on the skull, let's be sure to super bright highlight some of the areas on those teeth that are coming up. That's looking good. This part's looking good. Again, just giving those just a little bit of super highlight for them to really stand out. I think the TV show, if any of you guys ever watched it, the Venture Bros would be proud of what we're creating right now. Now, when it comes to the skull, there's all kinds of fun stuff, right, that you can do with the skull. But don't be scared to, have some areas of intentional flat color. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Now, last thing we want to do is introduce some of that purple again. So some of that super cool purple that you created for this section. Let's go in and let's start putting some of that up on the skull, especially on the inside. Little markers to give us some rim lighting, make it look a little bit more interesting within those shadows that are sort of dropping away. I'm going to use that hue trick here in just a second, where I turn my layer interpretation onto hue, but let's smudge some of this stuff out just a little bit before we do that. So over on the bottom left-hand side, you've got another plant feature that needs the same treatment as the right-hand side. Sorry, I think I can knock it out pretty quick. Creating that high area of contrast over the top of it. And then for the background, and then again, we've got some of that super bright green. That's just starting to catch some of the light. Yeah. Oh, I think someone's calling me somewhere. I'll try to answer that in just a moment. But yeah, for now, I'd say we're in a pretty good spot for this thing. So that's 23 extra layers. I'm going to collapse them into a group. So now you guys, at the end of this, we can see that what the before and after looks like. So before and after. Still likely some cleanup that can go on, but I hope that this helps to give you a good direction for when you're feeling a little bit lost with some of your brush strokes and your mark making that you're creating. That stuff is still important and it can still be a guide. But going through on that second layer and really thinking about the shapes that we're creating so that these feel a little bit more intentional for the tree forms is what's really going to help you out with these paintings. Do you guys have any questions? Anything I can help you with there on that?
Nope, you helped me a lot. Thank you.
All right, cool beans. Well, I'm so glad that was helpful for you.